The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the dusty freight road as Hazel Hart guided her wagon through the winding path near Shadow Lake, her heart heavy with the weight of 3 months' grief and a terrible purpose. At 20 years old, she had learned to handle the reins with steady hands, a skill necessity had taught her after her mother's death, but today her fingers trembled as she thought about the precious cargo hidden beneath bolts of calico and spools of thread. Wrapped in oiled cloth lay an ordinary-looking apron that held secrets worth killing for. Her mother, Margaret Hart, had worked as a maid in Conrad Brackett's grand house, until exhaustion and deliberate cruelty had claimed her life. Unable to read or write, Margaret had possessed something more valuable, a seamstress's eye for pattern and detail. During long months of servitude, she had developed her own method of encoding Brackett's corrupt dealings into what appeared to be decorative embroidery. Red threads marked payments to Sheriff Magnus Tate. Yellow indicated bribes to Judge Cornelius Webb. Green showed money flowing to Jasper Rattler Voss Brackett's cruel enforcer. Each flower bird and geometric pattern told a story of corruption that reached into every level of territorial government. Margaret Hart had died knowing too much work to death after Brackett suspected her loyalty. On her deathbed, she had pressed the encoded apron into her daughter's hands, with whispered instructions about finding Federal Marshal Lucas Hart in Willow Springs, the one honest lawman who might act on such evidence. The crack of a rifle shattered Hazel's memories, and the morning stillness. Wood splintered from the wagon's side as her heart hammered against her ribs. She yanked hard on the reins as 3 men on horseback emerged from behind pine trees, red scarves marking them as Brackett's enforcers. "Stop that wagon, Miss Hart." The lead rider, scarred and cold-eyed, raised his rifle. "We got business with you." Fears struck like lightning, but beneath it burned 3 months of rage fury at the man who had worked her mother to death, at the system that protected killers while honest people suffered. She snapped the reins harder, urging her horses into desperate flight. Another shot rang out, finding its mark with devastating precision. The rear wheel exploded in fragments, sending the wagon careening toward a boulder. Hazel threw herself clear as supplies scattered across rocky ground in chaos. She hit earth-hard shoulders, screaming with pain as she rolled behind sagebrush. Gravel bit into her palms, but she forced herself deeper into undergrowth, clutching the oiled bundle against her chest. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung in morning air. "Find that package," the scarred man ordered. "Boss says she's carrying something that belongs to him." They ransacked the overturned wagon, while Hazel pressed deeper into thorny brush, every curse and crash making her flinch. The apron felt impossibly heavy, 20 pounds of carefully encoded evidence that could expose Brackett's network of bribes, his illegal dam, and the deaths he had caused. A new sound cut through the searchers' voices, the whistle of an arrow followed by a man's sharp cry. Horses scattered as a Lakota warrior materialized from the reeds, moving like smoke made flesh. His rifle barked twice, sending attackers diving for cover. The warrior moved with practiced efficiency despite a pronounced limp, each shot precisely placed. In the chaos, he reached Hazel's hiding spot with fluid grace. "Can you run?" His English was accented but clear, carrying calm authority. "Yes," she gasped, though her legs shook. "Then move, stay low and follow me." They ran toward the lake as bullets whined overhead. The warrior, mid-20s with traditional braids and buckskin that spoke of cultural pride, guided her through cattails and fallen logs. His limp became more pronounced, and she noticed fresh blood staining his fringed shirt. Into the water, he commanded wading into shallows. They will not follow far into Lakota territory. Cold water soaked through her boots as they worked along the shoreline. Behind them, angry voices grew fainter as Brackett's men regrouped. "You are bleeding," Hazel observed, noticing how he favored his wounded arm. "Bullet graze? I have endured worse." He glanced at her bundle. "What did you take that they want so badly they would risk attacking a woman in daylight?" Trust had become a luxury she could ill afford, but this man had risked his life for hers, asking nothing in return. Evidence, she said finally. Proof of Conrad Brackett's crimes, bribes, illegal water diversions, maybe murder. My name is Hazel Hart, Wakiza of the Oglala Lakota. He nodded toward cottonwood trees ahead. There is shelter in the old winter camp. The abandoned camp sat beside a creek that fed Shadow Lake. 6 empty teepees stood like weathered sentinels, their buffalo hide walls intact, despite long abandonment. Wakiza led her to the largest, its entrance facing east by tradition. Your people lived here? Hazel asked, unwrapping the precious apron. Until Brackett's dam destroyed the water flow that brought salmon runs. His voice carried bitter loss. Now we live further north, away from fishing grounds our grandfathers used. She spread the apron on earthen floor, intricate embroidery, catching filtered sunlight. Every stitch represented hours of her mother's dangerous work. Show me this evidence, Wakiza said, settling beside her. My mother worked for Brackett 2 years before her death. She couldn't read or write, but she was the finest seamstress in 3 counties. Hazel's voice cracked as she pointed to patterns. When she realized what Brackett was doing, she began encoding his corrupt dealings. See these red roses, each represents payment to Sheriff Tate. Petals show amount, shade indicates month. Wakiza leaned closer, grasping the implications. Your mother was extraordinarily brave, and she died for it. Tears threatened. Brackett worked her 18 hours daily. When she started asking questions about midnight meetings with officials, her duties got harder. She collapsed from exhaustion last winter, worn to nothing by his deliberate cruelty. I am sorry for your loss, Wakiza replied with genuine sympathy. My family has also suffered. My sister Ayana worked at his mine's laundry. She disappeared 3 weeks ago without trace. Disappeared how? Failed to return home one evening. Next day, Voss told our chief she had run away with a drifter, but Ayana would never abandon her people. I believe they took her to pressure our band into surrendering water rights claims. His jaw tightened. They underestimate our determination to protect our own. They stared at each other across the encoded apron, 2 people from different worlds bound by loss and desperate need for justice. I need to get this to Federal Marshal Hart in Willow Springs, Hazel said. It's the only way to stop Brackett and save other families. And I must find my sister before Voss decides she's outlived her usefulness. Wakiza flexed his wounded arm. Perhaps we can help each other. You need protection through dangerous country, and I need allies who understand white legal systems. As afternoon shadows lengthened, exhaustion claimed them both. Wakiza arranged his gear near the entrance, positioning weapons, within reach his rifle-available hunting knife beside his sleeping roll. Close enough to grab, but not hidden. You should rest, he said, settling against his saddle. I will keep watch, then wake you for your turn. But as darkness fell and his breathing grew deep and regular, Hazel realized something troubled her. Warriors didn't survive by falling into unguarded sleep with strangers. The weapon placement seemed deliberate, available, but not defensive, as if he wanted to see what she would do unobserved. The realization struck he was testing her. She could take his weapons. A quick grab for knife, then rifle, and she would have advantage over a wounded man. Many settlers would expect exactly that trust, no Indian, regardless of circumstances. Instead, Hazel quietly opened her sewing kit, removing needle, thread, and scissors. She heated the needle in dying coals until it glowed. Then approached his wounded arm with careful movements. His eyes remained closed as she cleaned the bullet graze and began stitching torn flesh. Working with precise efficiency that had made her mother famous, she drew the wound closed. This will hurt, she whispered, though she suspected he heard every word. Wakiza's body remained still as needle-pierced skin, but she noticed slight tension in jaw muscles suggesting consciousness beneath sleep's facade. When finished, she tore a strip from her petticoat for bandaging. Her stomach growled, reminding her of the single biscuit remaining her last food. Without hesitation, she broke it in half, placing one portion beside his hand. Night air carried autumn chill. Hazel removed her wool shawl and spread it over the sleeping warrior, tucking it around his shoulders. Then she took his rifle and positioned herself by the entrance for vigilant watching. Hours crawled by. Near midnight, careful hoofbeats on rocky ground reached her ears, riders approaching slowly, trying to muffle movement. "Someone's coming," she whispered, shaking Wakiza's shoulder. His eyes opened immediately, alert and focused. For a long moment, he stared in surprise, taking in the bandage, the half-biscuit, the shawl, his rifle in her competent grip. "You could have killed me," he said quietly. "I could have robbed you and fled. But then we would both be alone against Brackett's men. You tended my wound. Mother taught me healing with needlework. She said women must know how to mend what gets torn. And you shared your food. Seemed decent." Outside, hoofbeats grew closer. Wakiza moved to peer through a gap in tippy wall. 4 riders, moving like men who know the land but don't belong here. Brackett's men, most likely. He gathered gear swiftly. "We must leave immediately." They slipped into pre-dawn darkness, abandoning shelter for uncertain safety. But as they reached where horses should wait, torchlight flickered between trees. "Halt, territorial sheriff's posse." Magnus Tate's voice carried official authority, underlaid with cruelty. "You're harboring stolen property and aiding a fugitive." "This way," Wakiza whispered, leading toward deeper lake water. They reached water's edge as boots crashed through undergrowth. A rifle cracked bullets splashing inches from Hazel's head. She gasped and stumbled, but Wakiza's hand steadied her as they waded deeper. "Stop there," Tate boomed across water. "You're wanted for Frank Morrison's murder and that woman's harboring criminal evidence." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Morrison had been an honest freight driver. If dead, it meant Brackett was eliminating witnesses. "What murder?" Hazel called back, voice shaking. "Lakota raiders killed Morrison 2 days back, stole his cargo. Your Indian friend matches the killer's description. Come out, or we'll drag you out." Wakiza's grip tightened. She saw bitter knowledge in his eyes. The lie was dangerous, regardless of truth. "I never killed Morrison," Wakiza said quietly. "But they will hang me whether I did or not." Water was knee-deep and getting deeper, shockingly cold. Behind them, Tate's men prepared to follow despite obvious reluctance. "Can you swim?" Wakiza asked. "Well enough to save my life." "Then we go underwater, follow the shoreline toward canyon. Stay close, don't surface until I do." He disappeared beneath black surface. Hazel followed, heavy dress dragging as she kicked desperately to keep up. Water was shockingly cold, turning muscles sluggish. Her lungs burned as they swam underwater toward hoped-for safety. When they finally surfaced behind reeds 50 yards away, Tate's torchlight flickered uselessly, while his men debated wisdom of following desperate fugitives into Lakota territory at night. "Let them go for now," Tate said. "We'll pick up their trail at first light. They can't get far on foot." Wakiza pulled her into shelter of a fallen log, both breathing hard and shivering uncontrollably. Water dripped from his braid's lips, blue in starlight. "That was no random patrol," he observed. "They knew exactly where to find us. Betrayed, or we underestimated Brackett's intelligence network. Either way, we cannot return anywhere they might expect." He studied dark canyon walls. "There's an old deer trail through rocks to higher ground. From there we can reach Willow Springs without main roads." As they prepared to leave cold shelter, Hazel realized something fundamental had changed. The test was over. They had both proven trustworthy. She had chosen healing over harm when given opportunity for betrayal, while he had risked his life for a stranger, then trusted her with vulnerability. "Wakiza," she said as they began wading towards shore, teeth chattering. "Yes, when we reach town and face Brackett's people, you can count on me completely. Whatever happens, I won't abandon you." He paused in shallow water. dark eyes reflecting dying stars. "I know," he said simply. "You have shown me who you are, Hazelheart, and I have shown you the same. Now we are bound by choice, not just necessity." They climbed from the lake into pre-dawn darkness water, streaming from clothes, breath-forming small clouds. Behind them, Tate's men camped to wait for daylight, confident their quarry couldn't escape the tightening net. But they underestimated two people who had found something worth fighting for: justice for the dead, hope for the living, and precious trust grown in a single night's trial. The canyon trail proved treacherous, winding through narrow passages between towering rock walls that pressed inward like ancient ribs. The route was barely wide enough for single file, with crumbling ledges dropping 60 feet to jagged boulders. Wakiza led with sure-footed confidence, despite his limp being more pronounced in cold air. She could see him favoring his wounded arm as he used handholds on steep sections. "Stay close to the wall," he warned at a particularly narrow ledge. "Test each step before full weight." Physical challenge was compounded by exhaustion and lingering cold from their midnight swim. Hazel's damp wool dress chafed and made every movement awkward. Her hands were so stiff she could barely grip rock holds several times, depending entirely on Wakiza's strength. "How much further?" she asked during a brief rest, trying to hide how badly her legs shook. "The worst is behind us. Another hour to the plateau where we can see Willow Springs." He studied her face with concern. "Can you continue?" "I have to. That apron represents my mother's life work. I'll crawl to Willow Springs on hands and knees if necessary." As they resumed climbing, Wakiza shared more about his sister's disappearance, perhaps seeking distraction from their discomfort. "Ayana wasn't just a laundry worker. She was learning healing from our grandmother before the old woman died last winter. Her knowledge of plants and medicines made her valuable. She could treat injured miners and guards without asking uncomfortable questions about how they got hurt. You think that's why they took her? Partly. But there's more." His voice grew heavy with worry. 3 days before she disappeared, Ayana told me she had seen something terrible: white men forcing Lakota women to work without pay, beating anyone who complained. She wanted to tell the tribal council, but I convinced her to wait for more evidence. The guilt in his tone was unmistakable. "You were trying to protect her. I was being cautious when I should have been decisive. Now she may be paying for my hesitation." He paused at a narrow gap, testing a natural bridge's stability. "Voss came to our camp the day after she vanished, claiming she had run away. When our chief demanded proof, Voss became threatening. They emerged from the canyon as eastern skies showed first pale dawn hints, revealing rolling hills covered with pine and aspen. In the distance, smoke columns marked Willow Springs, still miles away. "We need horses and food before going further." Wakiza observed, scanning hills for habitation. "The climb and cold swim have drained our strength." As if summoned, they spotted a small ranch house in a valley below Stone Chimney, sending up welcoming smoke. Corrals held horses, and roosters crowing suggested a well-established homestead. "I know this place," Hazel said with first genuine relief in hours. "Walter Reed owns it. He buys fabric for his wife's sewing circle, always fair and honest." They approached carefully, aware Tate's men might have spread word to watch for them. But Walter Reed, weathered in his 50s, with kind eyes and calloused hands, welcomed them without suspicion after Hazel identified herself. "Of course I remember you, Miss Hart. You made the dress my Sarah wore to our daughter's wedding, finest needlework in 3 counties. He ushered them into his warm kitchen, where his wife immediately began preparing food. "What brings you out here looking like you've been swimming in your clothes?" Over breakfast of eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and strong coffee that seemed like the finest feast Hazel had ever tasted, she explained their situation carefully. She spoke of evidence against Brackett, the attack on the freight road, and Wakiza's assistance, but didn't reveal the apron's specific nature. Walter's weathered face grew increasingly grim. That man Tate ain't been the same since Brackett started paying him extra. Used to be just lazy and incompetent. Now he's actively corrupt, making him dangerous to honest folks. His wife Sarah, small with graying hair and fierce blue eyes, spoke from the stove. Conrad Brackett's been bleeding this territory dry for 2 years. His dam killed half our crop last season, and when Walter couldn't pay water fees, that snake Voss came around making threats. Oh, what kind of threats? Wakiza asked quietly. Said accidents happen to folks who don't cooperate with Mr. Brackett's business interests. Walter replied, fists clenching. Told us our barn might catch fire, horses might wander off, or Sarah might get hurt walking to town alone. We've been prisoners on our own land ever since. The revelation that Brackett's corruption reached even isolated homesteads drove home the scope of their enemy's power. You take whatever horses you need, Miss Hart, Sarah declared firmly. And Wakiza, I don't care what color your skin is or what lies Sheriff Tate spreads. Any man who helps fight Conrad Brackett is welcome at this table. The generosity nearly brought tears to Hazel's eyes, the first genuine kindness from strangers since their ordeal began. As they prepared to leave, Walter provided detailed directions to avoid main roads and Tate's patrols. There was a back trail through timber, following the ridgeline most of the way to town, harder riding, but less likely watched. They saddled 2 of Walter's best horses, a sturdy bay mare for Hazel and a powerful black gelding for Wakiza. Sarah pressed bundles of food and medical supplies into their hands while Walter checked their weapons. There's something else you should know, Walter said as they mounted up. About this freight driver Morrison, who supposedly got killed by Indian raiders. Frank Morrison was carrying more than regular supplies on his last run. Wakiza's hands tightened on reins. What kind of cargo? Payroll for Brackett's mine operations, but not the official payroll through the bank. This was cash for special payments, bribes, hush money, whatever Brackett needed to keep his network running. Walter's expression darkened. Morrison was an honest man, asking questions about why he was paid extra to carry unmarked strongboxes without knowing contents. The implication was clear. Morrison had been murdered by Brackett's men to prevent exposure with his death, blamed on Native Americans to serve dual purposes, eliminating a witness while justifying increased persecution of Lakota bands. Did Morrison have family? Hazel asked. Wife and 2 young children in Willow Springs. Eleanor Morrison's been beside herself with grief, worrying how she'll support the little ones. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. That poor woman doesn't know her husband died because he was too honest for his own good. As they rode away, following Walter's directions toward the timber trail, Hazel felt responsibility's weight growing heavier. This was no longer just about avenging her mother's death. It was about justice for Frank Morrison, safety for his widow and children, freedom for Ayanna and other captives, and hope for an entire territory under a criminal tyrant's thumb. The ridge trail tested both horses and riders to their limits, winding through dense pine forests and across rocky outcroppings, offering spectacular valley views. The path was barely wide enough for single file in most places, with steep drops on one side and towering cliff faces on the other. Hazel's borrowed mare proved sure-footed and willing, responding to guidance with intelligence of a horse accustomed to difficult terrain. Wakiza's gelding seemed to understand their mission's urgency, picking his way carefully around obstacles that could have sent them tumbling hundreds of feet into canyon below. They paused once to rest horses and share water from a mountain stream bubbling up from hidden springs among rocks. The clear, cold water tasted like freedom after fear and uncertainty, but they couldn't afford to linger. Your arm is bleeding through the bandage again, Hazel observed, studying Wakiza's face for pain or weakness signs. He glanced at the spreading red stain with characteristic stoicism. The riding has opened some stitches. It will hold until we reach proper medical care. Dr. Edwin Carver has an office on Main Street in Willow Springs. He treated my mother during her final illness, known for being fair and discreet. Hazel's voice carried conviction from personal experience. He served as field surgeon during the war, so he's seen enough suffering to know it has no color. A white doctor willing to treat a Lakota warrior accused of murder. Edwin Carver judges men by character, not race or accusations. Besides, if we're going to face Brackett and his people, you need full strength. They reached Willow Springs' outskirts as afternoon sun began descending toward western mountains, casting long shadows across the bustling frontier town. The settlement sprawled along both sides of Willow Creek, wooden buildings, canvas tents, and false-fronted businesses serving mining operations and cattle ranches throughout surrounding territory. Main Street bustled with typical afternoon activity. But as they approached the town center, Hazel's heart sank at what she witnessed. Near the general store, Jasper "Rattler" Voss stood with two of his men confronting a middle-aged shopkeeper who cowered before them with obvious terror. "Your payment to Mr. Brackett is 3 days overdue," Henderson Voss was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "That's a dangerous precedent in a town where accidents happen to folks who don't meet their obligations." The shopkeeper, a decent man Hazel had known since childhood, wrung his hands desperately. "Please, Mr. Voss, business has been slow. Give me another week and I'll have the money." "Another week?" Voss smiled with cold amusement. "That's what you said last month. Maybe what you need is proper motivation." He nodded to one of his men, who casually knocked over a display of canned goods, sending them rolling across the wooden sidewalk. Other townspeople hurried past with downcast eyes, pretending not to see the public humiliation of an honest businessman. "Next time it won't be just merchandise," Voss warned. "Mr. Brackett expects cooperation from his neighbors." The scene made Hazel's blood boil with familiar rage. This was the same systematic intimidation that had destroyed her mother, the same corrupt power that held the entire territory in its grip. Every person who walked past, with averted eyes, was another victim of Brackett's reign of terror. "We should help him," she whispered to Wakaza. "With what?" he replied grimly. 3 armed men against 2 fugitives. We would only make his situation worse while destroying any chance we have of reaching the real authorities." The harsh logic was undeniable, but it made the scene no less painful to watch. As they guided their horses around the confrontation, taking a side street to avoid notice, Hazel promised herself that Henderson and all the other victims would see justice before this was over. They noticed more men than usual wearing red scarves, Brackett's colors, and their presence seemed to cast a shadow over what should have been the cheerful bustle of a thriving frontier town. Dr. Carver's office occupied a neat white building near the Methodist church, identifiable by the small wooden sign and medicinal herbs in a carefully tended garden. They tied horses to the hitching post and entered through a door, announcing arrival with gentle brass bell chimes. Edwin Carver proved tall and thin in his 50s, with intelligent gray eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and gentle hands of someone dedicated to healing. He showed no surprise at treating a Lakota patient, focusing entirely on the medical situation as he examined Wakiza's reopened wound with professional competence. "Clean stitching work," he observed, cutting away Hazel's improvised bandage. "You did excellent work under difficult circumstances, Miss Hart. Your mother taught you well. But the wound needs deeper cleaning and fresh sutures to heal properly." As Carver worked cleaning the bullet graze with carbolic acid, applying new stitches with practiced precision, wrapping the arm in proper medical bandages, Hazel watched through the window for pursuit signs. The side street seemed quieter than Main Street, but she still counted several men in red scarves positioned where they could observe traffic. "Doctor," she said carefully, "we need to reach Federal Marshal Hart, but there may be men watching his office. Is there another way to contact him safely?" Carver finished bandaging Wakiza's arm before answering, movements deliberate and unhurried despite obvious tension. "Lucas Hart boards at the Sloan House on Elm Street. Beatrice Sloan teaches school here and has helped with situations requiring discretion before. She can be trusted completely." He provided detailed directions to the boarding house, along with laudanum for pain and additional bandages. As they prepared to leave, Carver placed a restraining hand on Hazel's arm. "Miss Hart, I want you to know that many folks in this town remember your mother fondly. Margaret Hart was a good woman who worked harder than anyone should have to and never complained about her lot. If she left you something that can bring justice for her death and relief for this territory's suffering, you have more support than you might realize." The words provided comfort, but emphasized enormous responsibility Hazel carried. This was about justice for an entire community suffering under Brackett's corrupt rule. The Sloan boarding house occupied a large, well-maintained Victorian building on a quiet residential street, lined with cottonwoods, whose leaves were beginning to turn gold with approaching autumn. Beatrice Sloan, a woman in her 40s with graying brown hair and intelligent hazel eyes, answered their knock with obvious wariness that transformed into recognition when she saw Hazel's face. "To Hazel Hart, child, what brings you to my door, looking like you've been dragged through a briar patch?" "Miss Sloan, we need help. It's about Conrad Brackett and evidence that can expose his crimes." Beatrice's expression immediately grew serious, and she glanced quickly up and down the street before ushering them inside with maternal efficiency. "Come in quickly, both of you. But before you meet with anyone, I think you two need to have an honest conversation about what you're really getting into." She led them to a small sitting room, away from the main parlor, where the late afternoon light cast warm shadows through lace curtains. For the first time since their desperate flight began, they were truly alone and relatively safe. "Miss Sloan is right," Wakiza said, his voice carrying a weight Hazel hadn't heard before. "Before we trust anyone else, even a federal marshal, we need to understand what we are asking of each other." "What do you mean?" Wakiza was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the peaceful street. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one carried the weight of bitter experience. 3 years ago, my band trusted another white lawman who wore a federal badge and spoke of justice. Captain James Whitmore, investigating reports of illegal whiskey trading on reservation lands. He met with our elders, promised protection from corrupt traders, asked for our cooperation in identifying the criminals. Hazel felt a chill of premonition. What happened? We told him everything, names, locations, evidence of the traders' crimes. 2 weeks later, Whitmore led a cavalry raid on our winter camp, claiming we had attacked his patrol. 17 of our people died, including my grandmother and 2 children. The whiskey traders were never prosecuted. His voice was flat, emotionless, but she could see the pain burning in his dark eyes. Whitmore was promoted for his service in quelling hostile activities. The revelation hit Hazel like a physical blow. She had been so focused on her own mission, so desperate to find someone in authority who could help, that she hadn't fully considered what she was asking Wakiza to risk. "This is different," she said. But even as she spoke, she heard the uncertainty in her own voice. "Marshal Hart is investigating corruption, not looking for excuses to attack your people." "Is he?" Wakiza's question was gentle but pointed. "How do we know? Because he carries a badge, because he speaks of justice." Captain Whitmore carried a badge too, and spoke very eloquently about the rule of law. Hazel felt her carefully constructed hope beginning to crumble. "Then what are you saying?" "That we shouldn't trust anyone. That we should just give up." "I am saying that your world may still have good people wearing badges, but in my experience, a badge is just metal that can be worn by evil men as easily as good ones." Wakiza's voice carried no accusation, only weary pragmatism. "You have faith in your system of justice, because it has not yet betrayed you completely. My people have learned to trust actions, not words or symbols. But this is my last hope." Hazel said, her voice cracking with desperation. "If we can't trust Marshal Hart, then my mother died for nothing. Ayanna will never be rescued, and Brackett will continue destroying lives forever." "Perhaps your Marshal Hart is different," Wakiza said gently. "Perhaps he is the honest man you believe him to be. but we must be prepared for the possibility that he is not. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their different experiences hanging between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Finally, Hazel spoke. "I understand your caution, and I know you have every reason to distrust white authority. But I have to try. This evidence is the only weapon I have against the man who killed my mother." Wakiza nodded slowly. "And I will stand with you when you try. But promise me this, if your martial heart proves false, if he betrays us as Whitmore betrayed my people, you will not hesitate to act. Trust, once broken, cannot be easily repaired. I promise." Hazel said, though she prayed she would never have to keep that particular vow. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the sitting room door. Beatrice entered with a tea tray, her experienced eyes taking in the tension between them. "Marshal Hart is waiting in the parlor," she said quietly. "Are you ready to meet with him?" Hazel and Wakiza exchanged a look, an understanding passing between them that whatever happened next, they would face it together with eyes open to both hope and betrayal. "Yes," Hazel said, gathering the wrapped apron from her saddlebags. "We're ready." Lucas Hart rose from a comfortable chair by the fireplace as they entered the well-appointed parlor. He was a man in his 30s, with brown hair, carefully maintained mustache, and alert bearing of a career lawman who had survived dangerous situations through vigilance and quick thinking. His hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm when he saw Wakiza, but Hazel quickly made introductions. "I'm Marshal Hart. This is Wakiza of the Oglala Lakota. He saved my life and is helping me bring evidence of Conrad Brackett's criminal operations to proper authorities." Hart studied Wakiza with calculating gaze of someone accustomed to judging character quickly. "You're the Lakota they say killed Frank Morrison. I did not kill Morrison or any other innocent person." Wakiza replied calmly, meeting the marshal's stare without flinching. "But I understand why Sheriff Tate finds it convenient to claim otherwise. Because Tate's been taking Brackett's money for 2 years, along with half the other officials in this territory." Hazel said, retrieving the wrapped apron from her saddlebags with trembling hands. "This proves everything." She spread the precious apron on Beatrice's polished parlor table and began explaining the encoding system her mother had devised over months of careful observation and secret work. Hart listened intently, occasionally asking questions about specific symbols or stitch patterns, his apparent experience as federal marshal evident in his understanding of corruption investigations. But something about his questions troubled Hazel. They seemed to focus more on how the evidence might be interpreted, rather than how it could be used to build a prosecution case. When she mentioned specific names and amounts, she noticed he didn't take notes, which seemed unusual for a lawman gathering evidence for federal court. "This is remarkable work," Hart said finally, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine admiration. "Your mother created a detailed record of criminal conspiracy that could bring down Brackett's entire organization. It has a certain theatrical flair that makes it quite compelling." The phrase struck Hazel as odd. Theatrical flair. It seemed an unusual way for a frontier lawman to describe evidence of corruption. She glanced at Wakiza and saw that he too had noticed the strange choice of words. "But to make arrests stick in federal court," Hart continued, "I need corroborating evidence, documents, witnesses, something concrete that confirms these encoded records." "What about Brackett's safe?" Wakiza suggested. "If he keeps records of these payments for his own protection, getting into his safe legally requires a warrant based on probable cause, and the territorial judge who would issue such a warrant is one of the names embroidered on this apron." Hart replied with what seemed like genuine frustration. "We need another approach that doesn't depend on the corrupt officials we're trying to expose." Beatrice, who had been studying the apron with growing fascination, spoke up from her position near the window. What about the mine itself? If he's holding Lakota women against their will as forced laborers, that's kidnapping and slavery federal crimes. You can investigate directly without local warrants. My sister Ayana. Wakiza said, immediately, hope flickering in his dark eyes. If she is being held there, she can testify about what she has seen and heard inside Brackett's operation. Hart nodded slowly, but Hazel noticed his agreement seemed too quick, too eager. A careful federal marshal should be more cautious about rushing into a fortified mining operation with minimal intelligence and no backup. A witness to Brackett's operations combined with this encoded evidence and whatever documents we might recover could be enough for federal charges, Hart said. But getting her out safely won't be easy. Brackett has 15 or 20 armed men at the Copper Gulch mine, all loyal and willing to kill to protect their positions. Not all of them are completely loyal, Hazel said quietly, remembering conversations with her mother. Mother mentioned an older guard who sometimes helped the laundry workers, a man named Ben Holbrook, who felt guilty about what he was forced to participate in, but was too frightened to openly rebel. That could be useful. Hart mused, and again his response seemed somehow calculated rather than genuinely thoughtful. We need to move quickly, though. I've sent word to the territorial capital requesting backup from federal agents. But help is at least 4 or 5 days away, possibly longer, if the telegram was intercepted or delayed. Something about that statement troubled Hazel. Why would help take so long, and then why would he emphasize the delay so strongly, almost as if he wanted to discourage them from waiting for reinforcements? They spent the rest of the evening planning their approach to the mine. But Hart's suggestions seemed oddly aggressive for a federal marshal who should be concerned about minimizing casualties and following proper procedures. He pushed for immediate action, arguing that every day increased danger to the captives. But his urgency felt manufactured rather than genuine. That we cannot wait that long, Hart insisted when Wakiza suggested they might gather more intelligence first. Every day increases the danger to Ayana and other captives. And Tate's posse will eventually track us here, no matter how careful we are. As night fell over Willow Springs, Beatrice provided them with dry clothes and their first hot meal in 2 days. Hart excused himself to send additional telegrams to the capital, leaving them alone for the first time since reaching town. Something troubles me about the marshal, Wakiza said quietly to Hazel as they finished eating. What do you mean? His eagerness to attack the mine immediately without proper preparation or backup. In my limited experience with federal lawmen, they are usually more cautious about such operations. He paused, choosing his words carefully. And that comment about theatrical flair, what frontier marshal uses such language? Hazel felt the chill she had been trying to ignore. You think he's not what he claims? I think we should be very careful about trusting anyone completely until we know more. My grandmother used to say, when the wolf wears sheep's clothing, it still has wolf's teeth. But when Hart returned an hour later with detailed maps of the mine layout and renewed urgency about rescuing the captives, his apparent dedication to their cause seemed to overwhelm their doubts. The maps were remarkably detailed, showing not just the main buildings, but also service roads, guard positions, and even the internal layout of several structures. I've been thinking about our approach, he said, spreading the maps on Beatrice's table. There's a service road that leads directly to the laundry building from the north. If we can reach it before dawn, we might be able to get the captives out before the main camp is alerted. Despite their reservations, the plan seemed sound, and Hart's knowledge of federal law enforcement procedures appeared genuine. His maps and tactical planning showed either legitimate intelligence gathering or incredibly detailed preparation for deception. As they made final preparations for what might be their last night alive, Hazel carefully wrapped the precious apron and secured it in her saddlebags. But Wakiza's warnings echoed in her mind, mixing with her desperate hope that they had finally found someone who could help them seek justice. The ride to the mine took them through increasingly wild terrain as they left settled areas around Willow Springs behind. The mining road, carved from mountainside by Brackett's crews, wound steadily upward through dense forests, with steep drops on one side and towering rock faces on the other. Hart set a careful pace, his apparent experience in frontier law enforcement evident in how he constantly scanned surroundings for ambushes or surveillance. But Hazel noticed he seemed to know the route unusually well, for someone who claimed to be investigating Brackett's operations from a distance. Every turn, every landmark seemed familiar to him. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder, their breath forming small clouds in darkness. When they paused to rest horses and study terrain ahead, Hart's familiarity with the mine's layout seemed suspiciously detailed for someone working from second-hand intelligence. The guard posts at the main gate administrative building and processing facility, Hart observed, studying the complex through a small telescope with professional competence. At least 12 men visible, probably twice that number inside buildings or sleeping in barracks. From their elevated position, they could see the sprawling Copper Gulch mine spread across a broad valley, like a raw wound in the mountainside. Multiple buildings arranged around several shaft openings with ore processing equipment and worker barracks, creating a small industrial city. The laundry building is separated from the main compound. Hart continued pointing out structures with suspicious precision. If Ayanna and other captives are there, we should be able to reach them without alerting the entire camp. As dawn approached, they could see women hanging laundry behind one of the smaller buildings, their movements clearly supervised by armed guards. 4 women. Wakiza said, voice tight with emotion, as he studied distant figures through the telescope. The tallest one moves like Ayanna. We need to get closer to be certain, Hazel said, but Hart was already moving toward his horse with urgent efficiency. Well, no time for extended reconnaissance. We go now while we have darkness to cover our approach. His urgency seemed excessive for a careful lawman, but they followed as he led them along what appeared to be a well-known service road that approached the laundry building from the north. Hart's knowledge of the route was remarkably detailed, as if he had traveled it before. They reached within 100 yards of their target without being detected, concealing themselves among pine trees, while Hart studied the building through his telescope with practiced ease. Single guard at the front entrance, young, not particularly alert. Hart reported with confidence that suggested previous observation. Service door on the east side window, facing the canyon on the west. Perfect for our needs. But as they prepared to move closer, something that had been nagging at Hazel's subconscious suddenly crystallized into terrible clarity. When Hart had removed his hat to wipe sweat from his brow, she had glimpsed a scar on the left side of his face. But Dr. Carver had mentioned that the real Marshall Hart had a distinctive scar on his right temple from an old bullet wound. Wakiza, she whispered urgently, her blood turning to ice as the implications hit her. I think we may have made a terrible mistake. But Hart had already moved, signaling for them to follow him toward the building with the confident gestures of a man who knew exactly where he was going. With growing dread, Hazel realized they might be walking into a carefully prepared trap, orchestrated by the very person they had trusted to help them. The laundry building proved to be a long, low structure built against the valley wall, with steam rising from its windows and the sound of women's voices drifting across morning air. As they approached the service door, Hart's movements seemed too confident, too familiar with the layout for someone conducting his first reconnaissance of the facility. You circle to that window, Hart instructed Hazel with quiet authority. Wakiza and I will handle the guard and any other security. But as Hazel moved toward her assigned position, she noticed armed men positioned in the shadows around the building, too many and too well placed to be coincidental. Her worst fears were confirmed when she recognized one of them as Jasper Rattler Voss himself, Brackett's chief enforcer, waiting with obvious patience for some predetermined signal. The service door stood slightly ajar, revealing an interior filled with steam from boiling laundry tubs and voices of women working under obvious duress. Hazel eased it open just enough to slip inside, finding herself in a room where 4 women bent over wooden tubs filled with soapy water and dirty clothes. The tallest woman looked up at her entrance, and Hazel's heart leaped with recognition. Despite her growing terror, this was indeed Ayanna, her features bearing strong resemblance to Wakiza, but softened by youth and femininity. Her traditional dress was torn and stained from weeks of forced labor, her hands raw from harsh soap and scalding water, but her dark eyes blazed with unbroken spirit. "Who are you?" Ayanna whispered, glancing nervously toward the front of the building where they could hear movement. "A friend of your brother's. Wakiza sent me. We have come to get you out." The other captives, a middle-aged white woman with bruised arms, a young Mexican girl barely 16, and Eleanor Morrison, whom Hazel recognized from descriptions as Frank Morrison's widow, looked up with sudden hope that was immediately tempered by fear. "All of us?" Eleanor asked, voice hoarse from weeks of terror and despair. "Yes, if you want to come. But we must move quickly. I think we may have been betrayed." But before they could move toward the window, heavy boots stomped across the building's front porch with obvious hostile intent, and the front door crashed open with explosive violence. "Well, well," Voss sneered, entering with 2 armed men whose red scarves marked them as Brackett's most trusted killers. Miss Hart herself come calling just as the boss predicted she would. Through the window, Hazel could see more of Brackett's men surrounding the building, cutting off their planned escape route. But what made her blood freeze in her veins was the sight of Hart, the man she had trusted as a federal marshal, standing calmly among Brackett's enforcers, with no apparent concern for being captured by criminals. "You did excellent work, Marshal." Voss continued with obvious satisfaction, emphasizing the title with mocking sarcasm. "Leading them right into our hands, just as Mr. Brackett planned." The terrible truth crashed over Hazel like an avalanche of ice and stone. Hart, the man they had trusted completely, the lawman they had counted on to bring justice, was one of Brackett's people. The real federal Marshal Hart was probably dead, and this imposter had been playing them from the very beginning with consummate skill. "Actually," said a cultured voice from the doorway, "I prefer to think of it as a masterpiece of theatrical performance." Conrad Brackett himself entered the laundry building with the confident bearing of a man who had orchestrated every move in an elaborate chess game. At 52, he cut an impressive figure in his expensive suit and polished boots, his silver hair and carefully trimmed beard, giving him the appearance of a distinguished businessman rather than a criminal mastermind. But his eyes, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy, revealed the truth of what he was. "Miss Hart." Brackett continued in mock politeness. "You have led me on quite a chase with your mother's little artistic project. But I must say, having my associate here pose as Federal Marshal Hart was inspired. It saved us considerable trouble in hunting you down like common fugitives." The man they had known as Hart stepped forward, removing his badge and revealing it to be an expertly crafted fake that would have fooled most casual observers. "Thomas Aldrich at your service," he said with a slight theatrical bow that explained his earlier comment about the apron's theatrical flair. "Professional confidence man and actor. Mr. Brackett pays very well for specialized performances." Hazel felt the world spinning around her as the full scope of their deception became clear. Everything, the boarding house meeting, the careful planning, and the detailed maps, even his knowledge of federal law enforcement procedures, had been an elaborate trap designed to capture them and recover the encoded evidence. "Where is the real Marshal Hart?" she demanded, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Ah, poor Lucas," Brackett said with mock sadness that made his cruelty even more chilling. "He met with an unfortunate accident while investigating reports of Indian raids in the backcountry. Very tragic these federal lawmen take such unnecessary risks in pursuit of justice that never comes. The implicit admission of murder sent chills through Hazel's entire body. They had not only been deceived, they had been led to their deaths by a man whose supposed authority they had never questioned, just as Wakiza had warned. "The apron, if you please." Brackett continued gesturing to one of his men with casual authority. "My mother's life work in needlework quite touching, really, but far too dangerous to remain in circulation." Aldrich produced the wrapped apron from Hazel's confiscated saddlebags with obvious satisfaction. "Quite ingenious encoding system. Your mother was far more clever than anyone realized when she was alive. A true artist in her own way. Unfortunately," Brackett added with casual cruelty that made his words even more chilling, "excessive cleverness can be extremely dangerous when it falls into the wrong hands. Without someone alive to explain the supposed code, it becomes merely a curious artifact of frontier craftsmanship." The death threat was unmistakable. He intended to kill them all and destroy the evidence, leaving no witnesses to testify about his crimes or the elaborate deception that had brought them to this moment. But Ayanna stepped forward with dignity and courage that had sustained her people through generations of persecution, her chin raised defiantly despite desperate circumstances. "You cannot keep us here forever, Brackett. People know we are missing and they will come looking eventually. People know exactly what I tell them to know." Brackett replied with practiced arrogance that spoke of years controlling information and manipulating truth. "And the story I am telling is quite compelling. Lakota raiders attacked this facility, killed several guards and workers, and took captives, including you, unfortunate ladies. The territorial government will use the incident to justify increased military action against the remaining hostile tribes." His casual dismissal of human lives revealed the true depth of his callousness. But it also revealed something else to Hazel, a flaw in his seemingly perfect plan. "What about Wakiza?" she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. "Where is he?" Brackett's slight smile faltered for just a moment, and Aldrich glanced toward the window with what might have been concern. "Your Lakota friend proved elusive when the moment came to bring him inside," Brackett admitted with obvious irritation. "But he will be found soon enough. My men are quite skilled at tracking fugitives through these mountains." The admission that Wakiza remained free sent a surge of desperate hope through Hazel's heart. Her partner, the man who had proven himself trustworthy in the deepest way possible, was still out there, still armed, and undoubtedly planning something to save his sister and the other captives. But Brackett was moving toward a desk in the corner of the room, and what he retrieved from it made Hazel's blood run cold. A small wooden music box, its paint faded and its mechanism obviously broken. He handled it with surprising gentleness, his fingers tracing its carved surface with what almost looked like tenderness. "Do you know what this is, Miss Hart?" he asked, his voice taking on a different quality, softer, but somehow more dangerous. "A music box." She replied, not understanding why he was showing her such a personal item. "It belonged to my wife, Margaret. She carried it with her from Philadelphia when we came west to build our fortune in the mining business." His voice grew distant, almost dreamy. "She would wind it every evening and listen to its melody while she wrote in her diary about our new life together." He opened the box, but no music played, and the mechanism was broken, leaving only silence where there should have been a gentle tune. Margaret believed in the goodness of people, Miss Hart. She thought that if we just worked hard and treated folks fairly, we could build something lasting and beautiful in this harsh country. Brackett's voice hardened. She was naive. Goodness doesn't cure consumption. Fairness doesn't buy the medicine that might have saved her life. Hazel realized she was glimpsing the twisted logic that had turned a presumably ordinary man into a monster. "So, you decided to take whatever you wanted regardless of who got hurt." "I decided to never again be helpless in the face of forces beyond my control," Brackett corrected with quiet intensity. "Margaret trusted in Providence and died coughing blood in a one-room cabin because we didn't have money for proper medical care. I learned that the only providence that matters is what a man creates for himself through strength and determination. He closed the broken music box with a soft click. Your mother was much like Margaret, trusting, naive, believing that goodness would somehow be rewarded. She died because she couldn't understand that in this world, the only justice is what we take for ourselves. The revelation of Brackett's twisted motivation made him more terrifying, not less. This was not simple greed or cruelty, but a methodical campaign born from profound loss and warped by bitterness into something monstrous. You have made one serious mistake, Hazel said, finding her voice, despite the terror gripping her throat. Oh, and what might that be? You underestimated what people will do when they have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. As if summoned by her words, chaos erupted throughout the building. Steam from the laundry tubs suddenly became blinding as someone, Ayanna Hazel realized, knocked over a pot of boiling water, creating a scalding cloud that sent guards diving for cover while cursing and shouting in pain and confusion. In the chaos, Wakiza burst through the west window like an avenging spirit, but instead of blazing away with his rifle in a futile frontal assault, he moved with calculated precision toward specific targets. His first shot wasn't aimed at Brackett or even Voss. It struck the support beam holding up a heavy water tank, suspended from the ceiling, sending hundreds of gallons cascading down to create even more chaos and confusion. The tunnel. Ayanna shouted over the noise of crashing water and panicked voices pointing toward what Hazel had taken for a solid wall. Behind the wash basins, there's a passage Ben Holbrook showed me. Eleanor Morrison, despite her weeks of captivity and abuse, moved with sudden purpose toward a section of the wall that looked identical to every other part. Her fingers found hidden catches that had been concealed behind hanging laundry, and a concealed door swung open to reveal a narrow tunnel leading into the mountain's depths. Ben's been helping us plan for weeks, Eleanor explained quickly as they herded the other captives toward the escape route while bullets flew overhead. He's the guard who felt guilty used to be a miner before Brackett forced him into security work. He showed us this old mining tunnel that connects to the main shaft system. Brackett's furious voice rose above the chaos. Stop them. Don't let them reach that tunnel. But Wakiza had positioned himself to provide covering fire, using the steam and flooding water to mask his movements, while picking off Brackett's men with carefully aimed shots. His wounded arm might be hampering his accuracy, but his tactical intelligence was flawless. Go, he shouted to Hazel as she hesitated at the tunnel entrance. Get them out. I will hold them here as long as I can. Not without you. My sister needs someone who understands the white man's law to help her testify about what she has seen. That knowledge is more important than anyone's life. The tunnel proved to be part of an old mining operation, carved from solid rock and extending deep into the mountain. As they crawled through the narrow passage on hands and knees, Ayanna explained what she had learned during her weeks of captivity. This connects to the main mine shaft system, she said, leading them through branching passages with the confidence of someone who had studied every possible escape route. Ben showed me how the tunnels connect. We can reach the canyon without going through the main compound. Behind them, the sounds of gunfire and shouting grew fainter as they put distance between themselves and their captors. But the tunnel was cramped and dark, forcing them to feel their way through passages barely wide enough for a single person. They had been crawling for what felt like hours when disaster struck. Above them, they could hear the heavy tramp of boots and the sound of voices, Voss and his men searching for them with systematic determination. They're right above us, Eleanor whispered, terror making her voice barely audible. A chunk of rock fell from the tunnel ceiling, dislodged by the movement overhead, and landed with a small crash that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. They all froze, barely daring to breathe, as the footsteps above them stopped. What was that? Voss's voice carried clearly through the rock, so close they could have reached up and touched the ceiling. Probably just a rat, another voice replied. These old tunnels are full of vermin. Check it anyway. The boss wants them found, and he doesn't accept excuses. They lay perfectly still in the cramped darkness, pressed against the cold stone floor, while more rocks and dirt showered down from above. Hazel could feel her heart beating so loudly, she was certain the searchers must be able to hear it. The slightest sound, the smallest movement would give away their position and doom them all. Above them, someone was probing the tunnel ceiling with what sounded like a rifle butt, testing for hollow spaces or weak spots that might indicate a passage. Each impact sent tremors through the rock around them, and Hazel could see the growing terror in the eyes of her companions. The young Mexican girl Maria Ayana had called her was shaking so badly that Hazel feared she might cry out in panic. Eleanor Morrison reached over and took the girl's hand, squeezing gently to provide what comfort she could in their desperate situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on, accompanied by Voss's angry voice. "Keep searching. They can't have gotten far." They waited several more minutes before daring to move, then continued their agonizing crawl through the tunnel system. When they finally emerged at a concealed entrance in the canyon wall, gasping in fresh mountain air after their underground journey, they could see smoke rising from the laundry building and armed men running in all directions as Brackett's carefully ordered operation descended into chaos. "We need to reach town and find real federal authorities," Eleanor said, her voice carrying new strength now that freedom was within reach. "I can testify about my husband's murder, and Ayana can tell them about the forced labor and other crimes." "What about Wakiza?" Hazel asked, scanning the mine complex for any sign of her partner while her heart ached with worry. "He is Lakota." Ayana replied with quiet confidence, born of lifelong knowledge of her brother's capabilities. "He knows these mountains better than any white man. If anyone can escape from that place, it is my brother." As if to confirm her words, a figure appeared on the canyon rim above them, Wakiza, moving with his characteristic limp but obviously alive and free. He had somehow extracted himself from the building and found his own escape route through terrain only a native warrior could navigate with such skill. But their reunion was brief. Dust clouds on the mountain road indicated pursuit, and they could see Brackett's men organizing search parties to scour the entire area with systematic thoroughness. "We need horses and weapons," Wakiza said as he reached them, his voice grim with the knowledge of what they faced. "And we need to reach civilization before they can spread their story about Indian raids and dead federal marshals." But as they prepared to begin their desperate flight, Hazel realized she still carried something that could expose the truth about Brackett's crimes. In the confusion of their escape, she had managed to grab something from Brackett's desk, not the broken music box, but a small leather journal that had been hidden beneath it. Opening it quickly, she found pages covered with Margaret Brackett's delicate handwriting chronicling her hopes and fears during their early days in the territory. But more importantly, the journal also contained loose papers that had been tucked between its pages, documents in Conrad Brackett's handwriting that detailed his criminal operations with cold, methodical precision. "Look at this," she told the others, her voice trembling with excitement. "Financial records, payment schedules, even orders for specific acts of violence. It's everything we need to prove his guilt." The desperate flight that followed would live in Hazel's memory as the longest day of her life. They had no horses, no food, and very little ammunition, while behind them came the full force of Brackett's organization, at least 20 armed men on horseback, guided by trackers who knew the country almost as well as the Lakota. But they had advantages too. Ayana's knowledge of the mine's operations, Eleanor's testimony about her husband's murder, Hazel's encoded apron and the stolen documents, and most importantly, the truth about what they had witnessed. If they could reach genuine federal authorities, they could expose not just Brackett's crimes, but the elaborate deception that had nearly cost them their lives. The chase led them through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country in the territory. Towering pine forests, where ancient trees blocked out the sun-rushing mountain streams that threatened to sweep away anyone who stumbled while crossing them, and rock formations that offered both concealment and deadly drops for the unwary. Several times they thought they had lost their pursuers, only to hear the sound of hoofbeats and shouting voices closing the distance, as Brackett's men spread out in a systematic search pattern designed to prevent any escape. "There," Wakiza said, pointing toward a distant settlement as they crested a ridge late in the afternoon. "Cedar Flats. Small town, but they have a telegraph office and a retired army captain who serves as territorial representative." The final dash to Cedar Flats became a race against time and exhaustion. They could see Brackett's riders gaining ground, pushing their horses hard in a desperate attempt to catch their quarry before they could reach safety and spread word of what they had discovered. They stumbled into Cedar Flats just as the sun was setting, gasping for breath and barely able to stand after their ordeal, the town's residents alarmed by their appearance, and the approaching riders quickly directed them to Captain William Henderson's office. Henderson, a grizzled veteran of frontier military service with intelligent eyes and the bearing of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions, listened to their story with growing amazement and anger. When they produced the encoded apron, the stolen documents, and explained their significance, his expression grew grim with the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything. "I've been wondering why we haven't heard from the real Marshall Hart in over a month," he said, his weathered hands gentle as he examined the evidence they had risked so much to preserve. "Now I know why. That telegram I received claiming he was extending his investigation was probably sent by these criminals to buy themselves time." Within hours, Henderson had contacted genuine federal authorities in the territorial capital, providing detailed testimony from all 4 survivors of Brackett's operation. The encoded apron, combined with Ayana's eyewitness account of forced labor, Eleanor's testimony about her husband's murder, and the documents stolen from Brackett's desk, provided overwhelming evidence of the criminal conspiracy that had corrupted an entire territorial government. Brackett himself was captured 2 days later while attempting to flee the territory with a wagon full of gold and incriminating documents from his safe. The fake Marshal Thomas Aldrich was arrested along with most of Brackett's remaining associates, though Voss managed to escape into Mexico and was never brought to justice. The trials that followed became the largest corruption cases in territorial history, resulting in convictions and lengthy prison sentences for dozens of officials and criminals who had participated in Brackett's network. The illegal dam was opened to restore natural water flow to Lakota fishing grounds and small farms that had been systematically starved of their water rights. The mine was placed under federal oversight with strict labor and environmental standards that protected workers and the surrounding community. Most importantly, the systematic campaign of terror and corruption that had held the territory in Brackett's grip for years was finally broken, allowing honest government and the rule of law to take root in communities that had lived under fear for far too long. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning when wildflowers bloomed along Willow Creek and the sound of children's laughter echoed through streets that were finally safe for honest people, Hazel Hart and Wakiza were married in a ceremony that brought together members of both their communities in a celebration of love, healing, and hope for the future. The wedding was more than a celebration of love. It was a symbol of hope and healing for a territory that had suffered too long under corrupt rule. Dr. Carver, now appointed as Territorial Health Commissioner, provided the wedding feast at his own expense. Beatrice Sloan, promoted to Superintendent of Territorial Schools, decorated the church with wildflowers and the finest fabric from Hazel's expanded business. Eleanor Morrison was there with her children, their faces bright with happiness for the couple who had helped restore their family's honor and financial security. Walter and Sarah Reed attended with gifts from their thriving ranch, while even some of Brackett's former victims, including the shopkeeper Henderson, who now ran his business free from intimidation, came to witness the marriage of 2 people who had risked everything to bring justice to their community. As the celebration continued into the evening with traditional Lakota dancing mixing with frontier fiddle music under a canopy of stars, Hazel found herself holding both the original encoded apron and Margaret Brackett's journal, two artifacts that told the story of how love could be twisted into something monstrous, but also how courage and determination could overcome even the most elaborate deceptions. "What will you do with them now?" Wakiza asked, following her gaze to the precious artifacts that had cost so much to preserve. "Keep them safe as a reminder," she replied thoughtfully. The apron reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they find the courage to stand up for what is right. But the journal reminds us that even those who seem trustworthy may sometimes be deceiving us, and that we must always be ready to act when trust is betrayed. She placed both items carefully in a cedar chest that would travel with them to their new home, a comfortable house, where they planned to raise children who would grow up knowing that justice, though difficult to achieve, and sometimes betrayed by those sworn to uphold, it was always worth fighting for. The last of the sunset faded from the western mountains as guests began making their way home through streets that were now safe for honest people to walk without fear. Hazel and Wakiza stood together on their porch, looking out over the valley where their children would grow up in freedom and peace. "Do you think we can trust that this peace will last?" Hazel asked, leaning against his strong shoulder. "Peace, like trust, must be earned again and again." Wakiza replied thoughtfully, his words carrying the wisdom born of experience, with both betrayal and redemption. "We learned that even those who wear badges and speak of justice may sometimes be deceiving us with elaborate lies. But we also learned that when trust is real, built through shared danger and mutual sacrifice, it becomes stronger than any deception. Then I choose to build that kind of trust," she said simply. "With you, with our community, with the future we will create together. But I will never again trust blindly without testing that trust through action rather than words." They remained on the porch as stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, two people who had found love and hope in the midst of betrayal and violence. Around them the territory settled into peaceful slumber, a community finally free to grow and prosper under honest law, and the hard-won knowledge that justice, though sometimes betrayed by those who claim to serve it, would always find a way to prevail when ordinary people found the courage to fight for it. The encoded apron and Margaret Brackett's journal rested safely in their cedar chest, their secrets revealed, and their purposes fulfilled beyond anyone's most optimistic dreams. But the lessons they represented, that trust must be earned through actions rather than words, that even badges and authority can be counterfeited by skilled deceivers, and that the only reliable justice is what people create for themselves through courage and determination, would live on in the hearts of everyone who had participated in bringing down Conrad Brackett's empire of deception. In the distance, the Eagle Fork River flowed freely toward distant seas, carrying with it the promise of renewal and the hope that future generations would remember the lesson learned in those desperate days, that in a world where wolves can wear sheep's clothing and marshals' badges can be worn by actors and confidence men, the only true safety lies in the bonds forged between people who have proven themselves trustworthy through the crucible of shared sacrifice and mutual courage.